Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on from in the world, because we know we have a lot of international loggers on, or attendees, to use a simpler term, at these infrastructure intelligence webinars. My name's Andy Walker. I'm the editor of Infrastructure Intelligence, and we have come to the final webinar in our 2021 series, which somewhat conveniently and appositely will be looking ahead to 2022 and what our esteemed panel think we should be looking out for in the construction and infrastructure sector next year. Inevitably, we will have a look back a little bit on the past year, which is obviously in many ways finishing the way it began, with the cloud of COVID hanging over not just the industry, but society as a whole. So I'm sure we'll probably look at a little bit of the issues around that as well, but hopefully as well look forward to what we can expect for our sector over the coming 12 months. We've got a very good panel, as always, with us today, drawn from a number of different parts of the industry, and I'm sure we'll have a very good discussion on some of the key issues that we all need to be looking out for in 2022. Without further ado, just to say, if you've got any questions, paste them in the chat and I'll pose those to our panelists either individually or collectively, depending on the nature of the question. And do look out for our report of this event, which will be up on our website, together with a recording. And hello, if you're listening again on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. They will be all up on our website sometime this afternoon, around about 2 to 2:30. Right, without further ado, our first panelist, which is Matthew Farrow, who is currently the Director of Policy for the Association for Consultancy and Engineering and the Environmental Industries Commission. Matthew is widely and vastly, dare I say it, experienced in the trade association sector, and particularly around environmental issues. Formerly with the CBI, he works very closely with organisations and companies, especially around the net zero issue, and I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that. He may well talk about the fact as well that today is his last time as Director of Policy for ACE and EIC, because he's moving to a new role in the new year as Deputy Head of the Environmental think tank organisation influencing body, the Broadway Initiative. So he certainly won't be a stranger to our sector and our industry going forward. Anyway, that's enough from me. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andy. I think the phrase vastly experienced is probably a euphemism for getting on a bit, isn't it? But I'll take it either way. So I wanted to flag up sort of three factors that are going to, I think, have a big impact next year. They're independent of COVID, and obviously a lot of how next year will look will depend on how COVID unfolds, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that during the course of this morning. But the three factors I wanted to pick up. The first is, the environment, I think, has decisively now moved into the mainstream for our sector. A couple of things behind that, some of which are obvious, some I think of which are less obvious. COP26 is the obvious one. I think enough was achieved at COP26 to make sure that the net zero focus, if you like, is not going away anytime soon. I think that's partly because out of COP26, some fairly short-term international milestones were agreed. So we're not going to have to wait 5 years for another big sort of climate change event. They're going to come at us thick and fast, and I won't go into the details of why that is, but some fairly short-term milestones were fixed there. I think the second thing around COP was, my experience over the years is that political interest in issues can rise and wane sort of fairly quickly. Business can be slow to get an issue, but when business does get an issue, net zero in this case, it doesn't let go. It gets into the business bloodstream, if you like. So COP26 means that net zero is here to stay. But when I say the environment is now mainstream, I don't just mean net zero, and I think this is an important point. During the first week of COP26, the Environment Act received royal assent, didn't get much publicity at all, actually a pretty ambitious new framework for UK environmental policy. Things like biodiversity net gain going to have a big impact on the infrastructure sector, nature recovery networks, lots of technical detail in there, but I think that will mean the nature agenda is coming up quite quickly alongside the net zero agenda, which is on everyone's lips. And I think for sort of proof of how embedded this is going to be, look at the way, for example, the Treasury, not usually the sort of greenest of departments, is doing some quite important things. So the fact that listed companies are going to have to publish net zero transition plans over the next couple of years is going to be a big factor. The fact that the Green Book was revised, I think, just at the end of last year to make things like net zero actually part of the Treasury, the way the Treasury calculates the value of projects. And I was also quite struck looking at the recent Transforming Infrastructure Performance Roadmap to 2030 document that came out, I think, a couple of months ago. Probably for the first time, I saw in that an infrastructure document which actually talked about the environment on an equal footing. So some of the graphics in there position infrastructure assets and infrastructure systems within the natural environment in a way green NGOs have talked for years, but I haven't really seen bodies like the IPA talk in that way. And I think in a forward to that document, the 25-year environment plan, again, not a document that's talked about very much in infrastructure circles, was positioned as equal to the National Infrastructure Pipeline, I think it was. So I think a real sort of mindset shift there. Second factor, though, is that thinking about net zero, I think we're moving into a different phase. I think the last couple of years have all been about setting the level of ambition, both at national level and at company level, organisation level. People are setting out their stalls. I think the next year and the next sort of couple of years are going to be about coordination and delivery. So if you think, for example, that about 70% of UK emissions are now covered by sector roadmaps to net zero, normally put together quite quickly by sector associations, a series of dates about when things will happen, all put together independently, not joined up at all. Alongside that, you've got local authorities declaring climate emergencies, starting to think about what that means in their particular neck of the woods. And I think a huge emphasis on what is actually much harder than setting the ambition. How do you join all this up? And I think, built environment projects, the role of the big strategic consultancies are going to be crucial in that. And then the last factor, I think next year is going to be an important year for what I sort of call the procuring for value agenda. It's big exercise, we're all involved with in different ways to actually change the culture of the construction sector. I think in the year just ending, we've seen most of the building blocks of that agenda fall into place. So Construction Playbook has been with us for a year now. The consultancy playbook came out during the year. We had the IPA pipeline, the new National Infrastructure Construction Pipeline, had a lot more detail in it. The Value Toolkit has finished its sort of testing phase. David Mosey, I think, was it yesterday, released his review on frameworks and some great ideas in there about a gold standard. I think all of these building blocks look to me like really good pieces of work. AC has been involved in sort of working up many of them, but they have to be more than the sum of their parts. And I think next year we may start to find out, are they going to work together to be more than some of their parts and start to create that real culture change that we're all looking for? And I think an interesting year from that point of view. I'll leave it there, Andy. Lots of things I could have mentioned. I think EDI is going to be pretty big next year. Levelling up, of course. I'm sure we'll talk about those in the discussion. But I think those three things are my sort of starters for 10 for 2022.
Thanks very much, Matthew, for that. I expected you to mention net zero and the environment, and you did. But I think it was an important thing to talk about as well. Just recently, I think we're about 3 weeks ago, when we had our post-COP 26 webinar, a number of the speakers referred to the fact, or lamented the fact, that they were a bit disappointed to see the issue sort of drift out of the public consciousness somewhat a couple of weeks after COP. And I think it's important that those issues are maintained in the public consciousness. I mean, obviously the government said a lot during COP and post-COP, and I think it's important that our sector holds the government to account on some of the promises that were made in that area as well, because obviously, as we know, the very planet is at stake as far as that's concerned, and our sector has got a key role to play. in that as well. So for the moment, thanks. Obviously, we'll hear from you again during the conversation and during the discussion. Our next speaker is Sue Kershaw, who's the Managing Director for Transportation at Costain. Sue has, again, significant and wide experience in our industry on a number of major projects, especially in the transportation sector. And I know that her insights are always worth listening to. Sue, over to you.
Andy, thank you so much. And Matthew, I fully agree with absolutely everything you've said, spot on in terms of net zero and delivery. 2022 is going to be the year of delivery across the whole piece in infrastructure. So what does that mean? That means we deliver everything that the government has ploughed huge amounts of money into. So Crossrail will be open. HS2, the tunnel boring machines are being assembled as we speak. The National Highways Programme is enacting as we speak. Big, huge projects there like Lower Thames Crossing will come to market. And aviation, we hope, will still be alive, and we're trying to make sure that that comes back in a different guise in terms of hydrogen planes, for example, and all the ramifications that has of making that aviation industry work for the UK and for our economy. Also the ports have to be Brexit proof, and we're working really hard on those now to make sure they are. There's been a few issues everyone's seen on the news with Felixstowe, but it's absolutely crucial we get the ports, and most particularly the free ports, really working. So in transportation, it's deliver. And how do we do that? It's all based on resilience, and resilience is such an important factor to me. Everyone on this podcast knows how resilient we've had to have been so far to get through Brexit, to get through COVID, to get through what's happening on climate change. That resilience is making us stronger, and we have to get even more stronger going forward. We need a resilient workforce that's very agile, and one also that really adapts to and embraces digitization. If we embrace that, as we have done over the last couple of years, we wouldn't be having this podcast today if we didn't. That allows us to use that other part of our brain that's so important, that creative part of our brain, that brain that comes up with big ideas, not just the really mundane administrative tasks that we have to do. So let's embrace digitization and the data that comes with that and use it really effectively. And to Matthew's point, re-leveling, absolutely crucial for the UK. We are an island now, we are an isolated island. We have to re-level. And how do we do that in transportation? We join the dots up. So we don't look at what's happening in rail, what's happening in roads, what's happening in local authorities. We look at it holistically, what's happening for that community, not only in terms of transportation, but jobs, their future, the social value. How can we make what we've got now in dynamic working work really well for everyone, whoever they are, wherever they are, whatever they have to do. And that's one part of my job at the moment I'm really excited about, because I think that is part of the new UK, and we've got to all work together in collaboration to do that. And how do we do that? Well, we've proven we've done that with Project Speed last year. We've had people from various different companies, organisations come together with one sole intent, is to make sure whatever's been proposed, whether it's Gatwick Station or whether it's a road up in Scotland, the intent is to make that work in the best, greenest, cheapest and most efficient way. People are sharing ideas, they're working together, the old boundaries are melting away, and that's something we must embrace going forward. So setting and sharing the same goals is really important for the infrastructure industry. And then lastly, one thing we've all learned, I think, is let's be more caring and understanding about our people and the people who work with us and the people we're providing infrastructure projects for. We've become such better human beings over the last couple of years. Goodness sake, let's not lose that. Andy, they're my thoughts.
Thanks very much, Sue. And I think that last point that you made there is a really important point to finish on in your introductory remarks. I also think that it's something that, unfortunately, given the current situation regarding COVID, we're going to need more of in the coming, well, I'm going to say coming weeks, in the coming days, sadly. But we've done it before, and you'd have to hope that we could actually do it again as well. Interesting as well to hear both of our first two panelists talk about the levelling up agenda as well, because that is going to be, well, needs to be more than just a phrase going forward. And particularly with further electoral happenings next year, the local elections and all the rest of it, even more important as well. So for the moment, Sue, thanks very much. Our next speaker is Neil Mcdonald, and this is the first time he's spoken at an infrastructure intelligence webinar. Neil is the Chief Executive of Thrive, which is a consultancy that works with various organisations, including a number in the construction sector, advising them on social value and basically highlighting the community benefit of what organisations do. Most recently, they basically announced that they were working closely in this area with the organisation Kia. So I'm really looking forward to what Neil's got to say on that issue, and I'm sure a number of other issues besides that. Neil, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be with everyone today. I'm Neil Mcdonald, CEO at Thrive. We are a social value consultancy helping organizations with bid writing, strategy, various other consulting aspects, but also we are a technology provider for capturing and reporting social value. So what I will talk to you about today is mainly through that lens of capturing and demonstrating social value. And I think, Andy, in terms of looking ahead, around what's going to be happening in social value and construction, we need to look at what has happened this year, because there are some quite fundamental changes. I feel that this year is the year that social value went mainstream in construction. It's been around for a long time, since the Public Services Act, 8 or 9 years. Construction is blazing a trail among ahead of most other sectors, all other sectors. But yet this year, I think it was the year it really got onto everyone's agenda. And I think a couple of the reasons for that are very aligned to what Matthew has already said there, and the social value agenda being part of that broader sustainability agenda that Matthew talked about. So for me, I think there's two, if you look at the year past, there's two reasons why social value has gone mainstream. One is talking to that point that I think that Matthew was mentioning, is that I think social value, we've got to a point in that there is a sustainability tipping point. That's how I describe it. We've reached this point where sustainability aspects are no longer a nice to have, they're a must have for organizations. And that is driven by client demand. We've talked about COP26. We've seen the activism over the last few years, and it is now demanded by clients, customers, looking at retention of staff. All of these issues feeding to this this point that we're at now, where there's this tipping point in sustainability. And actually, I just wanted to read out a quote that I read the other day from Larry Fink, who's CEO of BlackRock Capital, one of the world's leading investors. And he had written to his CEOs that he's invested in this year, and his message was all about this topic. And he said, the more your company can show its purpose in delivering value to its customers, employees, and its communities, the better able you will be to compete and deliver long-term durable profits for shareholders. So for me, this is the sustainability premium, the sustainability tipping point, and all organizations must consider this. The other reason why social value has gone so mainstream is that it is being driven largely by public procurement. So I don't want to get lost in acronyms and jargon, but Procurement Policy Note 0620 came out at the end of last year. As of the 1st of January this year, what that meant was that for public procurement, there needed to be at least a 10% weighting given to social value in tender appraisals, but also that contracting authorities could ask for any one or more of 52 different metrics to be measured and monitored around social value delivery. So that is massively driving the agenda. Linked to that is also another procurement policy note that came out this year, which is 0621, related to carbon reduction plans which is fitting into what Matthew said there, and the two hand in hand are meaning that this issue of social value delivery, environmental delivery is now gone mainstream. And so looking ahead and what that actually means, I think that I would wholeheartedly agree with Matthew with those sort of fundamentals in place. 2022 is the year where there is going to be massive scrutiny on the delivery of all of this across the sector. And if you think about it, there's now 300 plus government contracting authorities getting their heads around issuing tenders with requiring carbon reduction plans, proving carbon reduction, social value plans. That is just going to be a huge factor. We've seen a lot of tenders coming out this year with those demands in them. Next year, that is just going to increase significantly. And the big difference is going to be not just in putting in the right words to win tenders. The huge difference is going for next year, for me, it's going to be the level of scrutiny that is going to be put on delivery by these contracting authorities, and organizations must tool up to have the tools and support in place to be able to deliver and also to prove that delivery if they're to continue to win government work. And whenever I discuss this with many organizations, they say, and I'm sorry, I don't know the full range of people who are on the webinar today, Andy, but whenever I discuss this with organizations, many will say, but I don't, our organization doesn't bid directly for government work. It doesn't apply. In construction across the board, it does generally apply, because what we have seen is the big tier one contractors, many of whom we work with, their way of differentiating around all of this is to now push down those demands. The demands on them are now being pushed down the supply chain. They want the smaller contractors, the smaller consultancies to help them prove their delivery of social value, carbon reduction, all of that. And there's this huge trickle down that is going to be a major factor next year.
Thanks very much, Neil, for that. And I'm sure we'll have some further conversation around the issue of social value. It's very much, I believe, linked to the levelling up agenda as well. And I'm certainly keen to ask all of our panelists about those issues going forward as well. So, Neil, thanks for the moment for those opening remarks. Our next panelist is Sheena Sood, who is a partner at the construction law firm Beale & Co. Beale & Co. are a leading firm of lawyers in our sector, and lawyers who I've always found to have taken a holistic approach to the issues facing the firms that they represent. Sheena is a leading construction lawyer with many, many years of experience and knows our sector well. And I know that many of the engineers and other organisations in our sector have had cause to work closely with Sheena in the past. And I know that she will have some very interesting insights for the webinar this morning. So Sheena, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And good morning, everyone. You've asked me, Andy, to just really look ahead at 2022 and what the legal landscape might look like, and really interesting to hear the other panelists talk about some of those topics that I'm also going to mention from a legal angle. So I was going to talk a bit about building safety, because obviously it's been very high on the agenda this year and will be going into 2022 and beyond. I was going to touch on the public procurement changes that lie ahead. So interesting to hear Neil talk about that as well, in terms of the changes of emphasis, if you like, on public procurement going forward. And also just touch on some, again, legal angles in relation to climate change and what we've been seeing and predict going forward. So just firstly on building safety, as I say, it will be high on the agenda again next year. And in one sense, I think there has been a frenzy in a way of activity on the legislation side and the industry side post Grenfell. But on the other sense, and in terms of preparing for today, I've been looking at what changes actually have been implemented and are there since Grenfell, and very little has yet changed. Obviously, a lot in the planning, but little yet changed. So what we do have is the ban on combustible materials that we saw fairly soon after Grenfell. We've got the phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry report, which amongst other comments made a finding that the external wall of the building didn't comply with the building regs. We've had the controversial EWS 1 forms that RICS published and are now in use to assist with lending and valuations on buildings. We've got the Building Safety Fund, the £5.1 billion that's there to remediate, and some of that remediation is happening at pace, but lots remaining to be done. And we've got the residential property developer tax in place now, which taxes profits for residential property development companies above 25 million. So we've got some changes in place, but when you sort of look at all of that, in one sense, not much. So what does 2022 hold in relation to building safety? Well, we have got the bill, which is making its way through Parliament, the Building Safety Bill, onto its third reading in Parliament, and next stop is the House of Lords, and then hopefully law by summer 2022. And that will bring big change. We've seen that it will bring new roles within the industry. All of this aimed at filling the gaps that Dame Judith Hackett identified post-Grenfell. So we've got the new roles of the building safety regulator, the building safety manager, the accountable person, principal designer, principal contractor, now also under the regulations, the building regulations. We've got this potential extension of the limitation period for bringing claims under the Defective Premises Act, which looks to shift the limitation period from 6 years to 15 years with retrospective effect, so that, you know, claims that may have been statute barred now perhaps on the table again. And we've got these series of regulations that are already there in draft to be looked at, which are governing things like construction products and higher risk buildings, and setting out the duties of these various different new roles. So there's a lot out there for businesses to look at in order to get ready, and it's at a level where businesses can actually take cognizance of what's out there. So we've got draft regulations, we've got fact sheets, we've got the HSE also providing some very useful information. So that's all aimed obviously at improving building and fire safety in the industry going forward. We're left with a whole rump of cladding claims. You know, I think pretty much every law firm in my area will have a number of claims that they're involved in looking to apportion responsibility for the cost of the remediation. Lots of those already notified, some for limitation reasons, maybe more going forward. There are many buildings to be remediated, so lots and lots of costs associated with that. What we're seeing for our clients is these claims flowing down the supply chain. Many of the original project participants no longer around. So with the joint and several liability that we have under English law, you'll have companies taking responsibility for others' mistakes. And you've got, you know, in hindsight, standards of care being sort of put forward by claimants, massive legal, massive expert costs around these claims, and obviously insurers running scared of anything that has the word cladding or fire safety in its name, both obviously within their claims book at the moment and also going forward. Nothing yet that's got to the court in the UK, which sets out how this might be looked at by the courts. We've got the Lacrosse judgment in Australia, which gives some insight as to how liability might be apportioned on these claims. And we've got a sort of sense of the direction of travel that the English courts will adopt from some interim decisions on. And it shows a bit a leniency, if you like, and sympathy of the courts to the claimants in these cases, in my view. So that's building safety. I said that I would mention public procurement reforms. Post-Brexit, sorry, the government is looking to simplify the regime. So we had the December 2020 Green Paper transforming public procurement, which set out some proposals for reform. Consultation period ended in March this year. And the government have recently published the key areas that they'll be looking at for reform. And they're looking at, in one sense, an update, in another sense, subtle changes to the general principles of public procurement. So instead of equal treatment, fair treatment. And I'm sure that will build in some of what Neil mentioned about social value and showing that within the bids that the industry is putting forward. Some tidying up the rules, some streamlining of the procurement procedures, and a new procurement review unit, which is to sit within the Cabinet Office to oversee this. So that's ahead for public procurement. No bill as yet, so in one sense, fairly early days in terms of the changes, but they are coming, following the sort of extraction from the EU. And then just briefly on climate change, I think it's quite interesting listening to Matthew on this. From the legal perspective, we've already seen the courts taking much more of a more intense scrutiny over the regulators. So we've had recent decisions late this year, actually, from the courts, which show that they will hold the regulators to account around air pollution, around emissions. And that was the Silverdale Quarry case quite recently, where human rights-based arguments were used successfully to challenge the regulators. And we have the new public body set up already in November of the Office for Environmental Protection, which is tasked with protecting, improving the environment by holding government and public authorities to account. You know, we're yet to see, it's not fully established, we're yet to see what teeth it will have, what powers it will have. But that's a very interesting move to create a new public body around environmental protection. And within the law, within contracts and within insurance policies, we're seeing drafting taking account of climate change and amendments to the drafting to make contracts climate friendly and to be aware of those issues within the drafts of contract, which is great. It's one thing's legislation, another thing is the courts controls, and then the third thing, which is more immediate, I think, is the contracts that we all sign up to and the insurance policies that we all invoke. So that again is an interesting move around climate change. Those are just some of the thoughts on as to what lies ahead, Andy.
Thanks very much for that, Sheena. And I think it's good that you've flagged up some of those government related moves as well, particularly the stuff around some of the legislation that's coming down the track at the industry, which clearly will have an effect or should have an effect on the way the industry works in 2022. Our next panelist is Alex Challoner, who's a board director at the public affairs consultancy Cavendish Advocacy. Alex has spoken at a number of our events in the past, and I'm sure will give us a bit of an insight into potentially some of the, I suppose, some of the political developments that might shape what might happen in and around our industry in 2022, and a little more besides as well. So, Alex, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Andy. Always a pleasure to be part of a panel for you, and really interesting to hear sort of what fellow panelists were saying before. Always very happy to pull the sort of the last straw in the bundle at the end. So I've got to make sure here I don't repeat what any other panelists were saying. But I'd like to start because your premise at the beginning was a little look back at 2021 before we shoot to 2022. So let's just quickly touch on 2021. Politically speaking, I think for construction and the infrastructure sector, I think, there was a pretty high sort of level of political optimism for both construction and infrastructure at the beginning of the year. Coming out of the pandemic, I think you'll all recall we had the Build Back Better growth paper that really sort of set out some big themes for government as to how we were going to build and construct ourselves. It's one of the few things that we could be doing at that moment in time in terms of moving out of the pandemic. And I think that that set the sort of the level significantly high. We had details of £100 billion capital spending plan for 21-22, covering towns, cities, road, rail, aviation, and broadband. And it, at that point, I think it looked genuinely very exciting. Fast forward, I think some of the air began to come out of the balloon, so as to speak, and I think we've ended the year on a bit of a damp squib for, not just for the obvious reason, of course. We had, and I think politically it was important, we had the scaling back of HS2, which I know was within a number of other integrated measures for the North, but I think that sort of scaling back of that leg of HS2 between Birmingham and Leeds, I think was very significant. I think that sort of dented certainly some of the ambition around levelling up, particularly for some of those, in the northwest up to Yorkshire. And of course, then we had a delay in the levelling up white paper, so bit of a bumpy end to 2021. But I think looking ahead in 2022, I am a little bit more optimistic, despite putting aside what's happening currently. We are going to have the publication of the levelling up white paper, Yippee Doodah Day, at the end of January, beginning of February. That's the mooted point. We had a little leak of that about a week ago in the Independent, which I don't know whether colleagues caught a snapshot of that, but I think there's some really interesting things in there for construction and infrastructure moving forward, and happy to elaborate on that in questions. We've also got the delayed planning bill. What happened to that? We had, we know we were promised a big sort of scaling up of reform around planning. That obviously sunk with the disposal of Robert Jenrick in the cabinet reshuffle, but that bill is coming back. Probably not before the local elections in May for political expediency, but certainly by the summer of next year, we will expect to have that bill back, and it'll be really interesting to look at, whether it has been watered down in terms of the scale of its ambition. So two significant things there, I think, to sort of come out of government and Westminster in 2022. Matthew and colleagues spoke a lot about COP26, so I won't sort of dwell on that, but I think that there will be some significant infilling, particularly around delivery in terms of how we're going to meet those ambitions to be net zero by 2050. So I think that's going to be another busy area in terms of government and Westminster. We mentioned the local elections at the beginning, and obviously we've had the results last night as sort of a stellar bad news for the Conservatives. I think the local elections are going to be pretty mixed for all of the political parties. I'll be perfectly honest come May. Clearly for the Conservatives, I think it's going to be, they're going to take a pretty hard bashing at those local elections. It's not going to be the stepping stone that some were talking about in terms of an early general election in 2023. I think possibly now we're definitely looking at staying the course to 2024. But I don't think there's going to be a huge amount that's going to turn around for the governing party in 2022. But I don't necessarily see this being a sort of a net gain for Keir Starmer at the moment. If you look at those results last night, Labour Party wasn't doing particularly well in terms of its own base. So I don't think that any of the bad news for the Conservatives is necessarily going to be reaped by Mr. Starmer. Devolution. I think it's going to be massive next year, devolution. We know it's going to be a key part of the levelling up white paper. I think there's going to be some really interesting proposals that come out of that. Chief, of course, we're going to be ending the two-tier system, or certainly that's what Westminster wants in terms of England, sort of mirroring what we have in terms of local authority structure in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I think there's going to be a huge political backlash to that, particularly from Conservative councillors who are going to find themselves, some of whom are going to find themselves out of a job, pretty smartish if all of that is implemented. So I think that's going to be an interesting one to watch. I think we're going to probably be expecting less on Scottish Indie referendum next year. I think that a lot of that is going to be bogged down in the courts. Again, I think it will resurface at some point, but I don't think it's necessarily going to resurface very much in 2022. I still think we're going to be grappling in the early stages, obviously, with the coming out of the pandemic again. So I don't think it really creates the sort of political bandwidth for people to be sort of really sort of focusing on that. I'll just sort of throw a couple of things out there internationally as well, which I think might be of interest to some of the audience. I think that those organisations who are more focused internationally, if you're hoping for we've obviously last night we had the Australia trade deal go through, so that's good news for for companies who are looking at doing more trade with Australia. We're not going to get something quick with the US. Forget it. That's going to be bogged down for a long time. I think President Biden's going to have a pretty bad set of elections midterm in November, and I think his focus is going to be inward rather than outward. So I discount that. I think there's going to be more geopolitical flashpoints, I'm afraid. It's kind of current crisis has knocked out, what Russia is doing with Ukraine, but I'd expect a little bit more around that early in the new year. I think it'll be slightly better news with China, funnily enough, because I think the Chinese are really focused on getting out of the current crisis with COVID. So I think that that's where going to be their focus for the next 12 months. And expect a lot more, folks, unfortunately, on inflation and more labour shortage supply problems. I think that's going to be pretty endemic for 2022, and it's all going to be causing us a bit of a headache. I'm going to end with a bit of a top tip. I think we've got a really interesting French presidential race shaping up for next year. I think we're going to see, we've got the potential of seeing our first woman presidential candidate, which I think is going to be really exciting. Valérie Pécresse, and I think if she makes the final two in a runoff, I think she'll give President Macron a good run for his money.
Thanks very much for that, Alex. And as always, looking at some of the wider political developments, which so often do affect our industry, and I think it is necessary to be looking at those wider developments as well. Because they do impact on this sector, which, as we know, is a crucial sector for enabling politicians to implement the many promises that they make. We'll get onto some of those promises and some of those issues a little bit later. But I just want to throw one initial question to the panel, sort of an easy one to sort of get us going, and I'll pose it to Matthew first. What lessons do you think the industry has learned over the last couple of years, just broadly? What for you? What are the takeaways of the last couple of years? In some cases, unprecedented years as well. Matthew, what do you think?
Yeah, I think. The interconnectedness and the need to collaborate is, it's a pretty obvious one, I suppose. But I think COVID has brought that home. Traditionally, and in a sense, I'm an outsider. I wasn't involved in the industry directly until taking my role at AC a couple of years ago, previously working more on the environmental side. But I know there's been, long-term concerns about the fragmented nature of the construction industry. And I think to some extent, certainly COVID has really brought home to people, and I think sort of Sue touched on this as well, the sort of the people side of this, the need to work much better together. I think as well as, there's some encouraging signs about people recognizing that it's not about individual projects in isolation. It's about companies collaborating, but it's also about the projects being more holistic. So it's about bundles of interventions. Leveling up, I think, is very much going to be about to get it right, bundles of interventions that are geared to a particular place. Some of those interventions may be behavioural, car sharing, as opposed to just a number of big projects that sort of, look good and make the numbers look good. So that's probably, I think, the biggest thing. I suppose the other thing is just, it's been a harsh lesson for all of us in expecting the unexpected, particularly right now, I guess, with a deja vu for Christmas. But just, business planning has never been more challenging, I don't think.
Thanks, Matthew. I just want to turn to Sue for a second, Sue Kershaw, because Sue actually spoke at our webinar a year ago, where we looked ahead to 2021. It's always interesting to look at what people said. And to be fair to Sue, she's been quite consistent and probably quite right as well in terms of some of her predictions last year, because she talked about the question of resilience, also of authenticity amongst the industry and being true to your values. And I think, certainly that is something that, I'm keen to explore, a little bit further. But for you, Sue, what do you think the industry has learned over the last year or so? And how do you think that might feed into 2022?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think that the one that resonates with me the most, as well as being authentic and giving good value for money to the public purse, is actually going back to basics, the really brilliant basics. What are the basis of commercial management, design management, building, safety, you name it. If you get the basics right, the rest will follow. And we've had a real crackdown on this in Costain over the last year. Just pulling everyone back. People tend to want to go straight to the end solution. Well, no, let's build the basics, let's agree them, and then we will be much, much more successful in what we deliver. So it is the brilliant basics, Andy, definitely. And they're so easily lost because you get sort of transformed by, the bigger picture. But if you get the basics wrong, the worst happens. So that's where we're at the moment.
Turning to Sheena. Sheena, what's your view on, from where you're sitting, some of the key lessons over the last 12 months for the sector?
I think really just picking up on something Sue said, really, in terms of the basics not being forgotten. And whilst Sue's obviously commenting from the delivery point of view, from the legal point of view, and protection of your risks point of view, I think that's a really important lesson that has come home to roost for unfortunately, some companies. I think we're seeing more and more onerous contract terms with risk being passed down the supply chain or passed to those that aren't best capable of mitigating that risk. Alongside that, we've seen the courts adopting an approach where they will interpret the contract as it's written. Freedom of contract prevails with the courts. So you've got that on the one side with contracts, and you've got the hardening insurance market, reduced capacity, higher premiums, less cover, and in that sense, really a perfect storm. So why I've sort of latched on to Sue's comment about back to basics is the basics are important. Reviewing your contract, getting those terms right, making sure that you're including limits of liability, including net contribution clauses. There, as a disputes lawyer, I can't tell you how important those clauses are to protect against those risks. So yeah, back to basics. I totally agree.
Interesting that you talk there, Sheena, about risk. And clearly risk is now, as we've seen from COVID, a global phenomenon. It's not just something that you've got to consider in the UK, and looking at things globally and those potential risks that might be coming down the track. I wonder whether Alex has got any thoughts on that area, really, the whole issue of risk. And obviously, all of us have been affected by the pandemic, and I have to say, I think on the whole, the construction sector and infrastructure sector has responded quite well to the pandemic. It's already been mentioned, it's one of the few sectors that was actually working still during the course of the crisis. But what other risks, or are we looking at a different level of risk now in relation to COVID that we should be looking at in 2022? Alex, what's your thoughts on that?
I think the one thing I've learned, Andy, in the last sort of 12 to 18 months is, just prepare for the unexpected. And I'm not, at this moment in time, looking at my crystal ball, I'm not looking at something else that is going to spook the hell out of us. But I think just our whole collective approach to risk and how we prepare for it, how we sort of build it into our business planning is just absolutely key, because I've seen probably decisions taken over the last 24 months that would normally take best part of 3 to 4 weeks to go through in a matter of days, 24 hours, and it's the swish of the minister's pen. And as you say, I think construction on the whole has pretty much been ahead of this, which has been great, and has always been one of those sectors that's been protected, but it's given you a taste, I think, of what can happen in other sectors and industries. So, let's not get complacent, not that we'd ever do that, but let's just, all the time be thinking about, well, what could happen? And if it indeed it does happen, what we can do about it.
Thanks for that, Alex. And just turning to Neil, a number of our panelists have mentioned the issue that you spoke about when you talked earlier, and that the issue of social value over the last year, that your dealings with organisations in the sector. In your view, is there a greater understanding of the need to highlight the community benefit of what organisations are actually delivering? We know this is a sector that almost automatically delivers community benefit, because otherwise why are we doing what we do? But is there a greater understanding in your view of the need to actually promote that more?
Yeah, I think what's changed, Andy, over the last year, 2 years, as for me, I think the penny has dropped. That social and environmental sustainability issues are here to stay, and they actually need to be woven into the fabric of what is delivered, not just a tick box exercise on a tender submission or on some other aspects of compliance. So I think that's at a high level, that's the big change. But when you actually look at the penny has dropped, and it appears to me that the leading organizations are those who are embracing that and not resisting it. But I do think that, and that's okay to say for tier 1 contractors, the big professional services organizations, but I do think there is a real vacuum of knowledge further down the supply chain, and I think that needs filled. They're mid and smaller size organizations with a lot of demands on them on this, and they really are sort of rabbits in the headlights at the moment. So yeah, I think that's what needs to be addressed over the coming year.
Thanks, Neil. I want to turn to an issue now that we've all had to get used to, and this event is living proof of that, and that's virtual relationship building. Obviously, over the last couple of years, much has changed in our working practices and behaviours, and many people would argue for the better. But clearly, there are upsides and downsides to the virtual environment that we find ourselves in. So, just a couple of thoughts and questions from me for the panel: are our professional relationships as strong as they used to be? In considering that we having to do things in a virtual environment, and also given the fact that negotiation is key to so much of what we do in our day-to-day work as an industry, in our offices and all the rest of it, can we negotiate as effectively and achieve good outcomes virtually as we can across a table? And given the fact that it looks like this is going to continue for a little while longer yet, maybe those issues are worthy of some exploration. So, negotiation, even dealing with disputes, all that kind of stuff. What does that mean in a virtual environment? I'm going to start off this time with Sheena, because I'm sure that, she has had to move big time into that virtual environment in the recent period. Sheena.
Yeah, That's right, Andy. I think in terms of your first point about relationships and what impact has it had on relationship building, I think, this is a personal view. I think it does affect relationship building, especially obviously with new contacts. Building those relationships is going to be very different virtually than it was face to face, and it will impact. In terms of disputes, it's very interesting. I mean, this time last year, I was involved on a multi-party mediation that was done virtually. Probably at one point 42, 43 people on screen in total. And there was an efficiency around that way of doing things, that way of a mediator facilitating a settlement. And another mediation just shortly after that, where my client was based in Bahrain and wanted to come over initially to try and have the meeting face to face because they felt it was important to be in the room. But again, saw the benefit of great efficiencies brought about by virtual mediation. It's different. I mean, it can't replicate the way we used to do things. Certainly one-on-one negotiations, I think, is tougher. You can't read your opponent as well as you could in a room. So, yeah, it's different skills is what I would say, Andy.
Thanks for that, Sheena. Sue, your observations on that virtual world that we've all had to inhabit.
Yeah, it's fascinating because my first day with Costain was the first day of lockdown. So
baptism of fire.
It was total immersion in a virtual world. And I tell you what, my IT skills have improved no end. It's great.
Everybody's have.
But I think it makes the relationships different. Stronger, maybe not, but different, because you get to know people, I think, more as a person than as a professional. So, you see someone talking, then their kid is back in the background doing something silly, putting their faces up like this, or the cat walks across the screen or something. So you can have a sort of slight diversion of thought during meetings and recognize we are humans. I think it's made us a lot more productive. At the beginning of lockdown, we were doing back-to-backs from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, no break. It was ridiculous, but our productivity must have gone up about 20%. So there's two ends to it. So I think we have to project manage our lives a bit better and give ourselves break and breathing space and get away from the screens. But I think the relationships are good. I think in terms of negotiations, I'm with Sheena. You have to be in the room to look at someone's body language and just the way they move and say the words when you're doing the one-to-ones or two-to-twos. But I think on the wider ones, that discipline the virtual world gives us with real proper facilitation is powerful. And I think it's here to stay, Andy.
Thanks, Sue. Matthew, what's your view on this? Are our professional relationships stronger or weaker as a result of having to do this, basically?
Yeah, it's as Sue says, it's interesting, isn't it? I think overall probably weaker. I think it depends if it's relationships with people you knew before when you met them more face to face, either in your own organization or you met them regularly in another organization, and then you work remotely. I think actually it doesn't matter too much. And obviously for the first 6 months, a year of the initial lockdown, that was mostly the case for people. But obviously we're now in a situation, and I've had this in my team in ACE, where people have sort of joined the team and actually have left during the past 2 years. So they've never been working in a physical environment with others. And, I think that does make relationships more difficult. Thinking of a particular colleague in that situation, when I had to meet with them physically to get their laptop back and so on, and we had a chat and a drink, and I thought, gosh, I've learned more about this person in an hour than in 6 months of online meetings. It differs. I think some people find it easier than others. I think as we sort of find our way towards whatever the new normal, as people say, is going to be, I think a particular problem is going to be hybrid meetings, where you have some people who are in an office regularly and are meeting in the office, and other people who are based more remotely or for personal reasons don't come to the office very much, and they're on a screen. I think it's much easier meetings like this when we're all on screen or everyone's in a room, and I think organizations will find it difficult to have sort of equitable feel, as it were, when some people are virtual and some people are physically present.
Thanks, Matthew. Neil, what's been your experience in terms of relationships? How have you viewed those over the recent period?
Sorry, was that me, Andy?
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's been a funny contradiction, I think, for me. On one hand, from a business perspective, we're based in Belfast. We have a presence in England as well, but our head office is Belfast, and previously that meant a lot of business. The majority of our customer base is in England, so it's made it's leveled up that for us. We don't need to do that business travel. I think I would just mirror what Sue said in terms of operational efficiency. Tick. You can get a lot done. The one downside for me, being an inherent sort of strategic thinker, is just I get very frustrated when I just don't have people in the room to do those strategic discussions around a whiteboard, thrashing it out. And that's the one, as well as those personal side that Matthew said. That's the one that really lacks for me. But delivery tick, strategy not so much.
Thanks, Neil. And just finally on this point, turning to Alex, do you see any differences of building, in inverted commas, real and virtual business relationships? What's your view on that, or is it just the same?
Well, I mean, Andy, by profession, I'm a communicator. That's the sort of basis of my job, and relationships are key. I think what it's made me do is I've had to approach my relationships in terms of windows. I recognized I came out of the summer, like I'm sure a lot of colleagues here, feeling very optimistic, and then obviously I applied the risk-based scenario, and I thought, well, what happens if we get another shutdown at the end of the year? I've absolutely got to use these next 5 months to get around everybody I need to get around, just in case. And it goes back to my earlier point of just in case, things changing, world being turned upside down again. So I think it hasn't affected the quality of my relationships, but it's certainly affected how I've gone about managing them.
Okay, thanks for that. I want to turn to another area as well, and it's come up in the chat. There's obviously a load of issues that are going to come down the track at the industry next year. Some of them were similar to the ones last year. Some of them are maybe on a different level. Net zero, social value, leveling up's been mentioned, all kinds of other issues. Some of the legislation. We know that this sector historically has been challenged from a skills perspective. With everything going on, do we have the skills that we need in the industry? And particularly looking at things like digital and the emergence of that, not just the emergence, it's even more important than ever now. How will the industry, do you think, collectively address that skills challenge, which is an ongoing challenge, I think, for the industry going forward? And if I can pose that one first to Sue Kershaw.
Yeah, Andy, we don't have enough people, and that's been exacerbated by lots of people going back to the European homes they came from because of Brexit, and that's really hit in the trades. But also we're lacking engineers. We need 80,000 more engineers a year. We also need more apprentices. So there's a big gap that we have to fill, and I think we have to be creative in filling that. So when I employ people at the moment, I don't do the traditional, what are your qualifications and experience? It's what's your attitude to work? Do you want to be part of something that's exciting, that's going to change the world for the people living in it? And if you get people with the right attitude, it's just amazing what they can do. So I think it's changing that. It's also taking people from one sector to another. So taking people from the hospitality sector, for example, and putting them on community relations on the project works brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. And also, I think the one thing that I am most concerned about is the unemployment of young men. It's at the most, it's the worst it's ever been. And there's a reason behind that people aren't looking into. So basically, why don't young men think that it's worthy for them to work? What is putting them off so much? Why is that happening? That is something we've really got to sort out, because that's half of our future population we're talking about. So that's my way of sort of looking at it. So it's a gaping big hole, and we all have a duty to try and fill it, Andy.
Thanks, Sue. And I think interesting what you said there as well about you know, the need to actually reach out and bring people as well into the industry. If you consider the importance that the government has actually put on the construction and infrastructure sector in terms of delivering its agenda, you would hope that we could present the industry as a sector in which to work where you can actually make a real difference to people's lives. And I think interesting what you said there about attitude and what people's attitude to work is as well. You know, I think is quite important. You know, in that respect. And just throw this one over with a slightly different spin on it to Matthew, if I may. Just on this issue of marrying up, on the one hand, the government's focus on building back better and the need to actually deliver on some of its promises, and our industry's ability to actually do that delivering. Is there something there that the industry should be doing maybe better in order to attract more people into it?
I think two parts to that. I think, you know, I think the industry still has a way to go in terms of selling itself. I'm aware this has been an issue that's been talked about long before I've been involved in the sector, but about getting across, you know, the human purpose of the stuff we're building, I guess. And it's easy to say we should be better at selling that and difficult to do. I'd like to think that, you know, digitalization techniques and visualization and so on will all be part of sort of helping that. I think then, you know, there are, on the skills side specifically, you know, there are huge challenges. I think it's partly around not enough engineers, as Sue says, but also needing more non-engineering skills. So whether that's net zero and more carbon modelers and things like that, which, you know, SME consultancies in particular may not have, or sort of data experts and so on. And I think trade associations sort of earn their corn in these situations. You know, we did, I mean, as you'll know, Andy, we do an annual benchmarking exercise in ACE, trying to get under the skin of our members and some of the issues preoccupying them, as well as their financial metrics. And, you know, EDI is a big issue that, you know, a lot of our members are working very hard to understand and adapt to a fast-moving world. But a lot of our SME members were saying they would value more support from ACE, and that's something that we're very focused on. And then I think there are some practical ways that the sector and government can work together. So I think one of the best things that ACE was involved in the last couple of years, very much driven by Hannah Vickers, our previous CEO, was the talent retention scheme. So trying to make sure that, you know, during the turmoil in the initial lockdown in particular, when a lot of people were leaving organisations, that we work together to keep them in the sector as a whole, as opposed to losing to other sectors. And I think that sort of agile, quick thinking, you know, the sector and government working together is something we're going to need in the future.
Thanks, Matthew. I just want to come back to something that Sue said, because it was on my list of things to raise, and I don't want to go down a tangent on this one, but I think it is relevant. I was really interested to hear you mention the B word, which we haven't heard at one of our events for some time, that B word meaning Brexit, of course. Is it really the case that that's had such an effect on the industry losing some of its talent back into, as you described it, their countries of origin? Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Any thoughts from anyone else around our virtual table? I mean, I'm going to ask Alex, as our resident political guru in this situation, without getting into the whole Brexit argument. You know, do you see that could have even more of an effect going forward? You know, on business.
Well, I you know, it's been well documented that a lot of the changes we were seeing were going to happen anyway. But the challenge of Brexit by itself, let alone the pandemic, has put all of that change on steroids. Yeah. And that's the challenge we're probably all facing and grappling with. And although everybody's disciplines are slightly different today, but we all work within construction and infrastructure, I would guess that HR, personnel and talent and people have been top of everybody's lists for the last 6 months. It's been quite amazing, to be perfectly honest. And I think some of it is good because it will really stretch organizations and we've got to do better. But it also is just, you know, intense.
Thanks, Alex. I mean, from your perspective, Sheena, is any of these challenges in relation to skills, capacity, are any of those affecting? Do you see any of those challenges affecting, the risk profile of the industry? Do you expect it to affect the risk profile of the industry going forward?
I do, Andy. I mean, I agree. Lack of resources, whether that's trades, whether that's architects, engineers, all parts of the industry. But at the same time, we've got this push for competency. We've got this, throughout Dame Judith Hackett's report, lots of the industry bodies doing so much on competency, skills. Within the new legislation that's coming, real emphasis on competency. So it's not only a lack of resource, but it's also a lack of the right resources. And you've got many of these, contractors, consultants, others, a lot being asked of them. We've got these completely new roles where there's going to be really sort of heavy obligations to ensure building safety, and take on these responsibilities without, a lack of resource for these roles. We're seeing that within fire safety at the moment, a lack of fire engineers, and real pulls on them in relation to EWS, in relation to the expert side of things, in relation to remediation. But we've got these new roles as well. We've got a lack of the right competencies or the right skills for those jobs, whether they're new or whether they're some of the existing roles. And you've got this real pressure to deliver, and so I do think it's resources, and the challenges around resources is a real problem for the industry. I don't know what the answer is, but Brexit certainly didn't help.
Thanks, Sheena. I wrote a piece in Infrastructure Intelligence in the aftermath of the most recent budget from Rishi Sunak, and I echoed some of the points that have been made around the table today and talked about, we need to see delivery now, real delivery in a whole series of areas. The whole Build Back Better, great slogan, but what does it actually mean on the ground? And I just want to throw this one at Alex before starting to draw, to wrap things up. Will the likely political landscape for the current government next year mean that some of those big ticket promises for infrastructure might get derailed or even delayed until the next general election? Is that a danger in your view?
No, I actually think, if anything, I think the government's got to go harder and faster, because at some point we are going, the government is not going to be able to fall back on the excuses of the pandemic. It's not going to be able to fall back on the excuses of anything else. It will all be about judgment on that track record of delivery. So if in any way they've pushed things back unnecessarily, put things on hold, I think that will cost them politically at the ballot box. So I think, if anything, I've learned over the last sort of 6 to 12 months coming out of the sort of pandemic, but then sadly going back in, is that at some point that delivery track record is going to be tremendously important, and it will be and it will be the basis for deciding the next general election. It won't be about the reaction to the pandemic.
Yeah, because one thing's interesting, I just read some news reported in the Yorkshire Post, of all places, August Journal, has to be said, but also they said in there was an opinion poll done about levelling up, and 2/3 of people in the north said they haven't seen any benefit whatsoever as a result of levelling up. Full stop. That's their view. So it kind of echoes what you said there about the election. And there's been a lot of talk about levelling up, and the government's even got a department now. Michael Gove's got a new job title as a result of that. And I just want to ask very quickly before we move to our next question, our final question, about how do you view this this issue of levelling up, and what role does our sector have in helping to deliver that? Very quick fire around the table. Matthew, start off with you.
Yeah, I think the challenge with levelling up is the sort of elasticity of the phrase, as it were. You know, big difference with net zero, where ultimately you have a single metric and it's much easier to hold the government to account, which is why I think you see so much government activity on it. Levelling up, you can debate sort of what exactly it means. I think we've made some progress in terms of sort of understanding that, as I was touching on before, to do levelling up well, it's got to be place-based interventions which fit with that area and are sort of bundles of interventions. I suppose just picking up what you were saying, I'm absolutely right in what Alex was saying. You know, we've got a fractious political year ahead. The government is going to focus more on levelling up than on net zero, although net zero will continue, I think, because of this single metric issue. And the risk maybe is just a desperation to get some stuff done. So as you're saying, you know, the readers of the Yorkshire Post can look around and see stuff happening. And my fear, I guess, is that we lose some of the stuff we're learning about, you know, holistic approaches to projects. And maybe that's where all the procuring for value stuff, the value toolkit, the construction playbook needs to make an impact. But I think that's a risk in a desperate desire to be seen to be doing levelling up. We lose some of the sophistication, which I think our industry actually is in a better place to bring than it was, you know, 4 or 5 years ago.
Thanks for that, Matthew. Slightly longer answer I was looking for, but nevertheless, we've already heard from Alex. He thinks the government will do even more of it, be forced to, because of the political imperatives. Neil, what's your view on this levelling up issue? You know, can we get beyond the words and to real delivery?
Yeah, well, sort of with the social value side of things being part of that levelling up agenda, I guess what we see at an on the ground level is that with the government putting in place a procurement policy that says you can win more business from us if you do these various things like create employment opportunities, apprenticeships, training, other social mobility aspects. The reality is, from the work that we see, that organisations are adapting to that, and it is an incentive to put that in place. Whether or not, and so that will undoubtedly help. It's very hard to say the level at which it will help, and it's very hard to say your regional differences, how they will come in. Like, will it actually assist regionally, you know, more deprived areas than already prosperous areas? I'm not sure, but there is definitely some impact at a grassroots level of those procurement policies.
And Sue, what's your view on the whole area of levelling up in a brief nutshell?
It's happening right now, but the thing is, infrastructure takes years to deliver. But we're there on the A19, the A1, the M66, the integrated rail plan for the north, the union connectivity report by Peter Hendy. All the foundations are there. We're just going to get on and build it and get them into use, Andy.
The other thing on this as well, it doesn't always have to be the mega project either that actually makes a difference. I mean, I live in Durham, and due to the brilliant work of Jacobs, the local authority, and Balfour Beatty, we just reopened a bridge across the River Wear that's been shut for over a year.
Yeah.
And that's making a massive difference now. And just seeing people smiling when they're going across it, you know, walking across it, driving across it. That's construction. We need to shout about that much more than we actually do to actually show the real and positive benefits that this sector delivers. Final question time. Speaking of real and positive benefit, I want to finish on an optimistic note, and I'm going to ask all of our panelists to briefly give me an answer to this question. Notwithstanding the challenges that we face, notwithstanding Omicron and all the rest of it, give me a reason to be optimistic in 2022 for our sector. You know, what would that be? And I'm going to start off with Matthew, who's on mute still. Usually me who does that.
Left it till the end, didn't I? I think it's because, you know, it's a collaboration thing. We've learnt the hard way the importance of collaboration through the pandemic, and I think that will be a lasting benefit. And I think that means the industry is better placed to work together.
Sheena, reasons for optimism in 2022.
I think some of the great innovation we're seeing in the industry, you know, some remarkable work being done around digital delivery and around use of data, harnessing data. So and the use of sustainable materials and yeah, just some exciting, innovative work going on in the industry.
Sue, your thoughts?
We've proven we can deliver infrastructure under the most demanding constraints ever on the planet. So that means we can just deliver even better without them going forward.
Here. Neil?
I think with the various policy regulations, overall sentiment that's in place, what we will see next year is just organizations starting to deliver on the social and environmental sustainability agenda.
Thanks for that. And in a week where we actually quoted Led Zeppelin on the Infrastructure Intelligence website. Yeah, I don't know either. I'm a child of the 80s. Give us some reasons to be cheerful about 2022, Alex Challoner.
I'm going to build on Sue because, coming out, things are getting better now. We might not feel it, but they are getting better because people have been focused on making things better over the last 12 to 18 months. And I think if anything, the pandemic has sort of forced on people is that we want a better country coming out of the pandemic. So I genuinely believe that. And that's why I think, we have a good cause for optimism, even though we might not be able to feel it or see it at the moment.
Thanks very much. And again, to reiterate, I think, that even the smaller projects that our sector delivers, as well as the large ones, do make a big difference to people's lives. And I think it's incumbent on ourselves as people who work in this sector and who work in this industry to highlight that and to highlight the benefits that we actually provide to society as a whole. That's it. We're at the end of our last event of 2021. I'd just like to thank all of our panelists, to Matthew, to Sue, to Neil, to Sheena, to Alex for their insights during today. I'd like to also thank our strategic partner, BECG, for all their support over the past 12 months. We're looking forward to working with them again next year. We've already got our online program of events next year, and heightening the optimism, we also hope to be meeting in person next year as well. I hope everybody has the best Christmas that they can possibly have where you're celebrating it, and I hope everybody else manages to get some much needed downtime and relaxation as well over the course of the next couple of weeks. Above all, stay safe over those weeks as well. And thanks very much to everybody, to all of our attendees and listeners and watchers for taking part in all of our events this year. It just remains for me, Andy Walker, to thank everyone again and to wish you all the best, not just for the rest of this year, but also for what will hopefully be an interesting and, above all, optimistic 2022. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Andy.